Let's make history. From the west and middle of North America, welcome. Make yourself at home. This is the House of L. Open wide the doors to fandom. I am your not so humble host, the spirit of film himself, here with EDL. EDL, tell these people who we are.
Yeah, that's who we are. I think that sums it up right there perfectly.
Yeah, speaking of Gone with the Wind, you know who's gone with the wind all the time? Flying up there above the clouds, above us all. Superman. The amazing stranger from the planet Krypton. The last son of the dying planet. The Man of Steel. The Superman. Here we are here in the House of L, the House of Fandom itself, amongst all of us that make up the fandom's finest. Together now, we will introduce the world to the Superman. You probably don't think you need much of an introduction. You probably think you know everything about him. And honestly, you probably know the basics because kind of everybody does, right? Come from another planet, it blew up and exploded. He winds up here on a farm, Smallville, one day, Superman. But there's a lot more to the character. And there's a lot more to the character, and particularly these days, because there are a lot of questions out there about whether the character is still relevant. One article in particular recently said that another comic book character had completely and totally replaced Superman, particularly in the minds of the American people, which super guys like me and Mr. EDL think is a little bit, maybe not so correct. But we'll go over it. Talk about it, discuss it, and let you make the final decision. But it's just that adventure that, again, go back to that. That's why I think of that Action Comics. It's like the adventurous nature in you, the childlike nature in a lot of adults or just pure children. Just this guy's got a car over his head, and then you open up the pages and whoa, he can fly, and he's faster than a speeding bullet. It's A. Then the 1A part is that there's actually a lot of depth behind the characters. And it's like, that's why to me, he is the greatest character. He is solidly built through all the three layers that a character can have. He is constructed perfectly. And so most other characters, as you said, that don't have maybe the long lifespan, like the characters like the Shadow and the Phantom, right? They have some of those adventure elements, but they don't necessarily have the level that Superman does. And so it can hook you in with the fact that this guy is doing all these amazing things, leaping over the tall building in a single bound. The fact that he's rocketed here. There's the science fiction, the adventure element, the fantasy element, all this stuff from mythology and from science fiction is even what it was back then, and especially what it is now. He's got all that. And then, like I said, it's the fact that the heart of the character, that there's a purpose behind what he does because he is chosen to become one of us and is comfortable being one of us and is integrated so well that he is just like, another one of us that just happens to have these abilities. So he can take, again, you could take that extra mile. Hey, we all know somebody at some point that's from a farm. Much of my family, I've been on a lot of farms and whatnot, so the Smallville angle does kind of speak to me. Even if I wasn't, I know people that are, from farming type places. You all go to school with somebody that has some connection back to the rural communities, right? So you can kind of, see somebody like them, but if it's like your teacher who lived on a farm and then they go on a rant about how there's crooked politicians and they're teaching you about history and stuff, well, Superman, he acted on those things in his original issues, and he acts against Lex Luthor and these kind of, evil corporate guys. Then the following day can be fighting up in space like it's a Star Wars film, right? So that's why he's just constructed so beautifully that it lends itself to all these amazing adventures. But right behind that, 1A, right behind that, is that he's the relatable character because he is just ultimately also Clark Kent, the average everyday guy.
And I think there's something more to the relatability of that, and that, being on the farmland and then, going to, once he becomes an adult, he goes to a big city in Metropolis. It's just a different feeling. Anybody's moved to a different location. It's just, you get that fear, that anxiety, because you want to fit in. You don't want to necessarily go somewhere where you're just, not going to be accepted. It's the, truly the most scariest feeling in the world is going somewhere and not having, any connection or anything to it. And so, here he is, not only completely, ostracized from his cult, or not ostracized. Here he is, completely disconnected from his culture and from who he is, finding an identity and then leaving that identity to go create a different identity at a bigger city. It's like that hits the entire trifecta of, people in modern society today. And, it's one of those things that's like the most, I mean, how many other characters can you really think of that, that can hit all three of those at the same time?
Exactly. And that, again, that lends to the longevity of the character to this very day, from way back in 1938 all the way to this very day. How often have you heard people say that I had to bite my tongue, and it just, you have no idea how much it takes everything in me not to go off and give this person or that person a piece of my mind, and, not throw a chair at my boss's face. There's all these kinds of, memes and stuff that people have out there. It's like, again, there's Superman, who has all the abilities to completely punch someone out of existence, right? But he has to, even as most frustrated as he is, especially in the Clark Kent persona, he has to sit there and just bite his tongue and just breathe and let it go, because if not, it's going to get ugly.
No, I agree with that.
So again, every aspect of the character is just something that's just incredible.
It's something that you've talked to me about before, but first things first, it's like, okay, no comic book character is truly relatable, because nobody does what any of these characters have. Nobody's an alien or has genetic altercations that have given them superpowers, or when it comes to what a relatable superhero character is, technically there isn't one. But outside of that,
right. Well, it's the human aspect of the character, because again, even and this is why Superman is just the ultimate character, right? The Superman, because even as the Clark Kent persona, there's three elements to that. He's taken on the persona of Clark Kent, but Clark Kent in Smallville. So, like you said, the farm boy from the farming community and all that, Lana Lang and all, Pete Ross and all that kind of stuff that takes place in Smallville. The Clark Kent persona that he takes on in Metropolis, so Jimmy Olsen, Lois Lane, Mr. White, and how he operates around the town. And like you said, the kind of having to bite your tongue and try to hide in the shadows, and this character that can do anything, allowing himself to be bullied in the big city, or allowing himself to just be the big dumb farm boy in the Smallville purview of it. But at the same time, the third element is that underneath all that, he's Superman, and he's doing that because he wants to keep his ear to the ground, so to speak, to always be able to be there if the world needs him or people need him. With all the abilities and powers to be a god, Superman single-handedly could be an Independence Day army all unto himself. But the fact that he is grown up as one of us and then still chosen to remain one of us, and so where he could see himself as this god, this overlord, he is down with the rest of us, and then taking on all these different elements ultimately so he can try to do some good with that power, with the abilities that he has. And that's just that one little corner of the Superman universe, which is just, again, it's just staggering. You kind of know he started in the Depression back in 1938, mostly because it's always June 38 is on the cover of, Action Comics 1, that famous comic book cover. He's holding up the car above his head, and he sort of looks like what you would expect somebody in 1938 Depression America to look like, and you kind of get, he went through the years of, all these different cartoons and whatnot, and people have seen the black and white footage of George Reeves, and I'm always interested to hear how people see the character, themselves. And for me, I don't quite answer it all the time when I'm asked this question, but it sort of feels like he was always with me. It's like just the character has been so ubiquitous in my life because it was just, especially post Christopher Reeve through the 80s, there was all kinds of cartoons. The Superboy TV show was sort of an offshoot of the movies. The Smallville is supposedly an offshoot of. I don't never understood how that worked, but it's supposed to be an offshoot of the original movie. So, or the '78 movie. Christopher Reeve's first film with directed by Richard Donner. So, for you, I mean, where does it all start from you? Where do you, like, when you think of like the kind of the magic of Superman, the magic of DC Comics, where does that all start with you?
Well, for me, I think the easiest way to sum it up is my fandom was created through my brother. And, starting off, I mean, being the younger brother, being the sibling of everyone, I followed what everybody else did. And so, when I got started, I basically, was like, oh, who is this person? And my brother was like, oh, this is Superman. Who's Superman? He's the greatest hero of them all. And I'm like, oh, okay, there you go. Yeah, cool. Superman, greatest hero. Awesome. And that's kind of where
your brother was wise.
Right. And so that's where my fandom, originally started. And it started for us watching the original motion pictures with Richard Donner. And, I mean, we would spend summers on top of summers just, repeat watching the entire all four movies over and over and over again. We would study and dice.
Hopefully with a focus on 3 and 4.
Actually, yeah, because
Okay.
as
If you're,
no, I mean. Yeah, we would watch all of them, and we would watch them for different reasons. I mean, the first two because we would love those two, and then the other two because I mean, you want to complete the series, but also you want to find. Sometimes we watch them to find the good, sometimes we watch them to find the bad. But going from there, that kind of is what started my fandom of Superman. Is that we would do that, we would joke around and everything, and then from there. We kept watching those, and I don't remember who exactly. I think it was either my grandmother or my dad, one of the two. He would make a passing joke about this is your Superman, but my Superman was this Superman, and we'd be like, who the heck is George Reeve? And then from there we would. We would go on.
well, I can distinctly remember, I had that problem where it was like that thing that kids do, and you haven't figured the world out. And I distinctly thought that George Reeves was Christopher Reeve's father, right? So I thought it was like passed like Zorro, passed down from one guy to the next, right? That's sort of.
Yeah, no, I used to think the same thing as well. It made sense. I mean, like they have almost these similar last names, and they both kind of looked the part of Superman, so you just kind of assumed that it was like a generational lineage that was just passed on from one to the other, until you find out Kirk Allen was the first Superman. Then you just kind of left there confused on what happened.
Yeah, well, you're left confused because he kind of wasn't the first. They never credited him. He played Superman, and he didn't get a credit. Can you imagine that? Right, because that there was a mystique, such a mystique around the character. They didn't want, him to have, like, they didn't want kids to know, oh, it's Kirk Allen, former bodybuilder or whatever. It's like they were just like, it's Superman, the Columbia serials, and this is Superman. Right? I mean, just that sort of, number one, imagine that, and that's sort of insane. But at the same time, it's like that's the magic and mystique of the character that was still there, so powerful when I was a kid, growing up with that character being around.
No, I definitely get that. I mean, I would say probably the closest thing I can relate to, and I don't want to deviate too far away from this, but something else I used to grow up and believe was real 100% of the time was wrestling. And you would see a character like the Undertaker, right? And it's just like I didn't know anything about who he was, right? It was just he's the Undertaker. He didn't even have a name. He was just the Undertaker. So I can imagine what kids back in the day would see Kirk Allen and think to
Right.
themselves like, this is
Right. No,
Superman.
it's a powerful presence, like you said, to have it's a powerful thing to have something like the Undertaker. Second only to my own, the Spirit.
Yeah, no, it's definitely a fantastic name. I definitely have to give credit to the person that came up with that one.
The Undertaker. You guys should have stolen his original nickname to give it to me. Instead of Big Bad Mark, had been the Big Bad Spirit.
Right? Yeah, no, that would have been fantastic there. One of my favorite things to do was, as a kid, was always, once you learn that the history of anything, and not just for Superman, of course, when you become a fan of something, you always kind of just want to dive in and learn everything about it. And so we would go on these hunts, and we would go to swap meets, and we would go to to bargain bin places, and rental video shops when those were a thing, kids, back in the old prehistoric days of it. And we would try to find we would hunt down the Fleischer series of comic books.
Yeah, video rental stores actually predated Jurassic Park. That's think about that's true.
Speaking of precious and values, it was funny because when you would go to like those the swap meets or bargain places, and you would see a VHS of something, finding a VHS in a good condition of the original Fleischer series was always kind of a treat to find, because those were such an old and kind of ancient thing. And then VHSs, they sometimes weren't always in the best condition. Sometimes they would look like a legitimate thing, but they were actually recorded over something. So when you pop them in, or when you would watch, you would kind of get that static bar that would travel up and down the TV screen,
Yeah, they'd be all discolored, and the audio glitches were my favorite one, because it would like rumble. And those Fleischer, Superman, Max Fleischer, right? Those VHSs, the animation, the cartoon itself, they were just incredible. Honestly, still better than anything they're doing today. Putting it all together in one nice, perfect, little, animation. They still haven't topped that, what Fleischer did back in the Depression era, which is absolutely incredible. But the VHSs were so crazy, you have to try to collect them, and there'd be 50 VHSs, because you'd be looking for to complete the collection of all right, I hit the Mechanical Monsters, I need that one, and I'll have all the Fleischer serials.
And you would see that, and then you would look at Fleischer's animations, and it was still just kind of captivating and just stunning to see it in general. When one of my favorite ones is I forget which episode I forget what video one. I think it might be the machine one itself, but it's Lois and I think somebody else. They're about to get killed by lava coming from a volcano, and Superman jumps in. He opens up his cape to shield it from them, right? And then the lava is kind of going around them, and he's standing there heroically with the cape out, and it's just such a a stunning visual to see.
Yeah. No, that's the Mechanical Monsters. No, then you're right. You described it perfectly. But it's so cinematic. Again, you could if you did that shot for shot with Henry Cavill, people would talk about whoa, that scene was incredible, and it's just so the timing of it, the music, and he kicks down the door, and it's the quick little motif of that dun, 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 dun. The villain just cranks the lever back, and just like you said, it's just the animation of it. First of all, the animation of the lava flowing off the cape, but he saved Lois in the nick of time, and that's Superman, in action, in motion. It's sort of again, Superman the movie, when he catches Jimmy Olsen falling off of the dam, where all that water's coming out, and it's it's just that, and the motif of John Williams' music, all that stuff is that's Superman. To put quotations around that. If I was in a studio and we're watching some dailies or something, or a rough cut of a film, basically, right? If I'd see those sequences, I'd be like, okay, you're on the right track. That's Superman, and that is Superman done the right way, and Max Fleischer, those legendary cartoons, absolutely rocked it out of the park with that.
going from there, and seeing that, and then seeing the films, and all of these forms of media. When I finally got to an age where I felt comfortable reading, I wanted to start reading comic books so I can learn, read more about the history of it. Like I said, consume all the media I can of the character. And the first comic book I read, the first one, I got home and I was excited to read. I was fired up. I was so ready to read the stories of Superman through the comic books throughout the years in the history. First one I ever read, Death of Superman, where he fought Doomsday. That was definitely that was definitely a cherished memory of mine for sure. Right when I was at that young, impressionable age, I think it was like 8 at the time, when I first started to read the comic books, and I read The Death of Superman and went through that journey of, getting the issues and going through the battle between them, and, eventually culminating in Superman's death. And, at that point in time, I was, here I am soaring through the sky, thinking to myself, Superman, oh my God, got all this history, Fleischer, Reeves, and all this stuff, and then, up, he's dead. And it was,
I was gonna say it's a good one to start with, but it actually is a good one to start with, though. I mean, not just it actually would be a great starting off point for somebody, because you would learn the kind of comic book world and Superman's place in the comic book world. Not just because of how the whole universe reacted to him dying. It was this big thing. I mean, it was larger than life in the comic book universe, but also the idea of learning about the individual releases of comic books, right? And the release schedule, and the kind of understanding the inner workings of comic book shops and the fandoms and stuff. That it actually would be a really great place to start off, and you were right there in the middle of it.
Yeah, and one of the kind of the real kind of jarring thing for me was I remember when I first read it. Actually, I think it was about the third time I read it, because I couldn't believe it at first. Your idol, your dream, your hero. Seeing him finally dead on the papers, laying there sprawled out and everything. I remember being so devastated, so sad. I wasn't eating and everything, right? I remember just sitting there thinking to myself, it's over. And my dad would come up to me and be like, what's wrong, son? What happened? And I would think, I would go to him, and I was just weeping in tears, and I was just like, Superman, he's dead. He's gone. My hero and everything. And my dad looked at me and just knew how to come for me properly. I mean, come on, you have Christopher Reeve and George Reeves. I mean, this shouldn't be new to you. And I was like, well, what do you mean? And he's just like, oh, you don't know? And I was like, no, what happened?
You don't know. Born in 89, reading a comic book in 93. You don't know? You're not watching Inside Edition every night?
Well, I mean, that's how he was. He very interesting sense of humor, and he was just like, Christopher Reeves is in a wheelchair now, and I was like, what? How does Superman in a wheelchair? He flew off a horse.
He's a paraplegic, son, and my hero, the greater of the two, George Reeves, he's dead as a doorknob.
and so So even further from the fact that now.
Sorry. I'm sorry.
That's fine. It's just my childhood. So now coming from the fact that not only has have I seen my hero crushed in the comic books, but then to find out that historically speaking, Superman has this tendency to incur bad things to happen to its star and its idol. It was definitely something for me that was kind of that crude awakening that as great and mythical as these characters are, unfortunately the real life situation ain't always there for them.
Well, what stood out to me was that I was reading. It was probably the couple issues after he had, quote unquote, died. But I think the one that stood out to me was reading through one of the single issue comic books, and somewhere in there was a page. It was an advertisement for the upcoming books, but the whole top of the page, I remember it. It was like an obituary to Superman. It was just a gray stone gravestone, like a headstone, right? And it just had the S on it, and I that was the one that really stuck out to me because I don't want to get too morbid here, but that the first big passing, in my lifetime, in my family, of one of the big figures in my family had occurred at that time frame, and I'm standing in the same driveway where we had this family member get carted away, after they had passed, and I'm standing in the same driveway where I watched this happen. I'm in the same spot, and I'm opening up this comic book, and like you said, it's always been, just wild craziness and happiness and fun, and then like you said, it wasn't just Christopher Reeve or George Reeves or the Fleischer. I had records, and it was the artwork on the covers were unreal, and it was like Superman battling giant insects and just doing all kinds of crazy stuff. And then like you said, here I am in this driveway where not that long ago, one of the the patriarchs of the family, they were literally carted away, and I'm stunned standing there. And then all of a sudden I open up this comic book where it's always been fun and games and excitement and escape and adventure, and there's freaking headstone, this talking about Superman's funeral and the gravestone of Superman. So now I understand what you're saying. It did have an impact of whoa, on another. This is just on another level than what this isn't fighting the insects and chasing down Superman working with Superman. With Batman and Robin, they're chasing down some diamond thief who's trying to steal Fabergé eggs or something. I remember that being I think it was on one of those recordings. That was the adventure of the story, right? It was just so weird, but it was just so cool, right? And it's so different. Again, for me at that time, it was something so different where it's here's his headstone. He's in the ground dead like your grandpa, right? It's oh my goodness.
Well, sorry, go.
No, go ahead.
I was gonna say.
I was just. Yeah, no. Well, I was gonna say. Well, there is a flip side to it, but no. Go ahead. I'll come back to that.
No, I'll let you go from there, so I can.
Well, I was gonna say though there is a flip side to it because, and this is one of those things. I understand. Obviously, not everybody went through what I went through at that time, but I just thought I'd open up a little bit about that because something that crossed my mind. You were talking about childhood, and I hadn't thought about this, but you reminded me. It was and I'm not trying to get too philosophical here. However, when people talk about these being the modern day mythologies, and some people have compared them to a religion, there's a lot of religious elements. Michael, Uslan himself, who the legendary comic book figure, got the Burton Batman film off the ground and teaches comic books as a course at a college, if you can imagine that. But yeah, he talked about, they didn't, he had to convince them to teach him or to teach the class, and he was like, well, look, tell me the story of Moses. And when the person at the, I guess one of the big shots at the college who was in charge of, whether he was going to be able to teach this class or not, when he told the story of Moses, he's like, oh, yeah, it's Superman. It's the story, leaving Krypton, all this kind of thing, right? It's the same. Okay, I get it. It's mythology, right? But, I grew up Roman Catholic, so it's some of the only things, obviously, you don't want to remember a lot from sad moments in your life and funerals and stuff, but, if you have a priest that sort of, going about things, the way these things are supposed to be done, right? They'll talk about, sometimes they'll say this phrase the belief in life everlasting, the promise of new life, the promise of being, born again, and type of thing, right? Not a born again Christian, but as in resurrection after death, all that kind of thing, right? And there's an element of that in these superheroes, and like I said, I was thinking back to it. Yeah, I had that sort of where I wasn't going to get my grandfather back, and I knew the finality of that everybody has to go through when it's like you're the young kid and then finally happens with somebody in your family. With Superman, there was, all these hints of his return and the promise of new life after death. Yeah, in my little kid brain at that time, that was a powerful thing, and that's the power of the character, right? Like when people, it's a lot of people talk about like the All-Star Superman sequence. Superman, he just talk. This is key. He doesn't quote unquote save her, like he doesn't grab her by the shirt. He doesn't, save the day and I'll just take you off the top of this building. No, he just goes up there and talks with her and just gives her some, honest time, right? Which is all she needed in that moment, right? And that's what, like, she walks off that building. She doesn't commit suicide, right? And there's so many people that like, and I usually don't even react this way to that story because I know about its power, but I've never reacted to it like that. But I'm thinking about that's the power of the character, is like he's he's a friend, and he's a friend to anybody, and and he's that light, the shining light, and like the sun that he's always flying around, something to look up to, right, and to look forward to, the man of tomorrow and all this kind of thing. So it's like the promise of resurrection and that hope that he would come back was something, it's not like I don't want to overplay it at that. For me, it didn't. But imagine there must be people out there who it affected, right? There must have been people who were going through similar things, or maybe they've gone through horrific things as an adult or a young child, and just the idea that you could pick up this comic book and you could escape and have the promise of new life and new issues. Just that hint, that little kernel of hope that he could come back. And so if you were a kid, like you said, and you were thinking about it, now that I'm really kind of going back to that my mindset at that time, you weren't so sure that they were actually going to bring him back, because it just seemed like so much in the world had changed at that time. But anyways, I got all into it there. But yeah, it was. It's unfortunate. I think it's been sort of tossed aside as like just a gimmick, but there was a lot more to it than people kind of write it off as.
I think that goes a lot to just how impactful this character can be, especially even when things are done for publicity stunts and everything, and looking at the character from after that standpoint. I remember thinking to myself, there's what are they gonna do with it? What are they gonna do with Superman? Who's gonna step up? Who's gonna fight? Brainiac and all these things. Batman. Come on, it's gonna go nowhere fast.
Bibbo.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah. I remember
Bibbo and his pot belly. My favorite character from the what is it? What was that called? Sorry, the post death of Superman. I'm ashamed of myself. I forgot it.
I think it was like remembering a friend or something like that. Was I think like the title or something.
Yeah. No. But what was the whole? There was it was a funeral for a friend. Yeah,
there you go. Yes,
during that whole period. Yeah. But there was, because that is just so random. That just came out of nowhere. For me, that was my first okay, comic books are really random. But yeah, Bibbo, my favorite guy, because pot belly, he was wearing like a stretchy sweatshirt, it couldn't even cover his pot belly, but I'm gonna take over for the big guy. It's like, yeah, he's gonna fight Brainiac. This is gonna go well. He might. Hey, you know what? He might. We shouldn't. Hey, don't sleep on Bibbo, right? Because Brainiac could be like trying to assimilate his gut. It's too massive. It's overpowering. He blew up his system because he couldn't. And that's not a slight against people of size. I'm a large fellow myself, so yeah. That's why I wanted to be. I mean, that's why I liked him. I had a kindred spirit with that big old belly he had. Yeah, Brainiac, you can't reduce this belly down to your little bottle and like Candor. I'll bust right through that bottle, like I do my pants. But anyways, sorry. You're bringing back a lot of great memories. I'm sorry.
Well, that's
apart from all the death and sadness. Apart from all the death and sadness and emotional damage, but okay.
Let's not go back there. Anyways.
Sorry. You're leaving that part in. Especially when you go, let's not go back there. Okay.
Oh, God. This is unraveling.
All right. Keep going. Bibbo.
Okay. And I remember after that angle, there was I forgot where it was. I forgot where I found it. But I remember seeing it. It was like this weird green color, like a forest green kind of, but it wasn't like I don't know. It was this awkward green color, and it had the Superman S on it, and Superman, right? And I was sitting there like, what is this? Like what is this?
You're right. Didn't it say like he's back or something like that too?
Yes,
total swerve.
Yeah. No, it was. It had something like that, and I remember I popped it open for the first time, and I remember seeing it was the Superman S. It was it looked like
it
him.
was what it was. Is it had the cover, but the cover was sort of like a heavier paper or like a thin cardboard, and it was cut out. So the little S part was cut out, so that you could see the S from the next page. But when you opened it, and you're like Superman.
Yeah, no, and it was it was him. He had the S. He had his hands up like Ricky Bobby style, right in front of his face, glowing yellow, and then he had like the most 90 Ray-Ban sunglasses you could ever imagine sitting on his head.
It was straight up Cyborg, like the villain from the Van Damme movie Cyborg, right? Yeah. Excuse me. NWA, Eazy-E, straight up, right? It's like these weird Bret Hart, all that kind of stuff, right? It was just this weird, totally 90s like visor sunglasses and a turtleneck.
Yeah, and I remember thinking to myself, well, at least he's back.
Well, it was to explain. It was the Eradicator, which is a character that was involved in the whole death and return of Superman. But yeah, it was. I remember that it was a total swerve. I remember just like, and it was sort of funny the looks on the faces of the people in the comic book shops. Like when they're this, like you walk up to the counter with it, and then they're just because you're just so happy, and you're like you're kind of talking to yourself or whatever, and just like they knew it, and that was definitely my first like gotcha. For the comic, like I'm going, waiting in line, finding the shop that still has a copy of it, and you buy it. And that was this saga was a mega saga that really kind of introduced a lot of people, and it definitely me to a lot of the different things that comic books can do. What is a part of that community, and that's one of the things they do. These kind of like gotcha, and for lack of a better word, the gimmick. Yeah, because you open it, it wasn't him, it wasn't Superman, he wasn't back. It was this other character who was wearing the S symbol, but it was so, like I said, it was so brilliantly done. You didn't feel bad necessarily. You were a little bit disappointed, but you gave them credit because like they got you, and you were like, okay, yeah, literally cutting out the shape of the S on the comic book itself, so that you open it up and it's like, okay, here's the reveal, but it's not the reveal that you're looking for, and it just sort of carried the story forward, and because I think he winds up talking with Lois Lane at the end, and I think there's some ambiguity as to whether it's really him or like is this a different version of him or whatever. It wasn't it was all still a big mystery what was going on.
Yeah, they were definitely trying to sell the is it him? Because like after that, I remember seeing the other. They had the I think that the angle was known as the Reign of Superman. Because it was the Eradicator, it was the Cyborg Superman, who still doesn't have a different name than that, which is weird. And then you had the Superboy, which was, you know, probably the most 90s Superman character you could ever possibly imagine. And then and
Yeah,
then
you're right.
had-
You're right. It was the reign of the Superman, and they were sort of hinting at out of like you said, out of all these characters with Steel and the Eradicator, the sunglasses one, and the Superboy, and and then there was I used to call him Rambo Superman because he looked at him, he looked like Rambo with the long hair and the mullet, and then he had this all black costume, and he had like a giant machine gun. So it was like, it was the Rambo influence. It had to be. Like you said, it was pulling you in with the mystery of it because they sort of hinted at either one of these guys is Superman, like, maybe he's been reborn as Superboy. One of them will take over. So again, it was sort of ambiguous. Are they really going to bring him back? Or is the underwear and the red tights and the cape, it's all gone now? Maybe he'll be mechanical and Steel will be the new Superman. He'll be mechanical. It'll be like go down the Iron Man road, right? He'll carry the mantle forward. There was still that question they were leaving out there, for you to sort of wade through.
That's kind of what turned me. That's kind of what turned me off into comic books eventually was that not just with Superman. I would just start reading comic books, and eventually you just kind of you kind of start to see the pattern of them, the repetition of it, and it's always the same thing. There's always a twist. There's always something that's just kind of moving back and forth here and there.
Well, and that's the kind of thing too when you have this character that, as we talked about, he has all these almost an endless amount of dimensions, an endless amount of possibilities, the things that you can do with him, right? And yet there somehow has become this perception that the character is ultimately boring, and that all that somehow is boring, which to me it never added up even in the slightest way. I don't know how you could square that circle.
So when I'm a 90s kid. I grew up in the 90s and everything, and so that's where a lot of my frame of reference is. He ends up splitting himself, and they do all of these shenanigan type of angles with him, right? And it typically came down to the same thing, right? Well, he's so powerful. What else can we do with him? Oh, well, we have to kill him off and bring him back weaker, and then we have to split him into two different Supermans because how else can we tell a Superman story when he's been around for 50 some odd years, right? And one of the more interesting stories that I saw, and it brought me back, not just in the Superman, but it brought me back in the comic books, because I got fatigued, going into the 2000s. I got fatigued of comic books. I was like, that's a kid's thing, I'm in high school now. I'm too cool for that. One of the stories that brought me back, I remember reading it one day because I went to a library. I was ditching class, and I was hiding from teachers, and I grabbed the book and I was like, I gotta look like I'm here for a reason. So I grabbed the book and I opened it up, and it was For Tomorrow, which had just come out recently, and I remember reading that book, and long story short, kind of given the cliff notes of it, Superman tries to create a pocket dimension to store humanity in case our place decides to blow up for one reason or another. Pick your poison on that. We blow ourselves up, apocalypse, Brainiac, whatever, right? It's not the point, Just in case, though, he wanted to create a pocket dimension to shelter us. And through some comic book shenanigans, the entire like half the population just disappears off the face of the earth, and it becomes this mystery of why did that happen and how do I fix this. And it was interesting to me because it was a story that was original. I didn't read this at all at any point in the 70s or whatever. It was one of those original stories. And it was something that Superman could not solve this by punching it or running really fast or flying. He had to solve something without using his powers for the most part of it. Later on, he ends up fighting Zod, and he does get his punches in. But for the meat of the story, it's this mystery, and it's kind of, it ends up getting into this, conundrum of, Superman overexerting himself, and then, leaving it to an idea of, was that the right thing to do? Should he create, an entire dimension to store us? Is that something that's, should he do that, or should he leave us to our own devices? If we can't fix this ourselves, should he intervene, or should he just kind of, let humanity play its course, which is, always a great storytelling angle to run with Superman, because that is a Superman issue. That's he's the only character truly that, has that type of issue, because he's so powerful that he can do it, but should he do it? And so I was remember reading this, and it was just so interesting to me. Like, I could not put the book down.
Yeah, it always works out perfectly when you take on those kinds of stories about Superman choosing to intervene or not, like Superman 4, The Quest for Peace.
So yeah, that's why I looked at For Tomorrow, and for me, it was something that made the character interesting.
Yeah, no, that's a good one. I mean, that could go on a recommendations list. I would assume you'd put that on yours.
Yeah, definitely. I would put that on the list. I mean, there's a lot of other ones I would probably, plays, but I would probably say somewhere, in the top 10, I would definitely say as a good recommendation as an entry level into Superman.
Well, I mean, it's sort of a weird thing for me because, well, okay, I'll just say, well, the greatest comic of all time is Whatever Happened to the Man of Tomorrow, written by Alan Moore, the legendary Alan Moore. It's a Superman comic. And the artwork was by a legendary artist who came back to have his swan song. Kurt Swan came back to do the artwork. Legendary. I mean, just legends colliding, literally. In the story without it. There's so much history to it, and maybe you kind of have to know about everything and have a sense of things before the story really kind of makes sense for you. So maybe that shouldn't be the first one that you read, but if you feel you know enough about the character, and you know about Krypto, the super dog, and you know about Brainiac, and if you know about that stuff, I would say go for it, because to me it is just magnificent. It's just incredible. It's the most incredible comic I've ever read. Back when I was totally sane, I read it, and it reduced me to tears, so you can imagine if I pick it up now. But anyways, yeah, I would say I'll ask you this question, because one of them that would be on my list, again, it's a little bit complicated. Sorry that we have to make things a little complicated, folks, but it gets a little weird here. But because there's a story that it's become a famous animation recently, but it's a different name in the original comic. Because the original comic book is What's So Funny About Truth, Justice, and the American Way. The animation is called Superman versus the Elite. I know you're a big fan of that one. I mean, I would definitely recommend that one. I mean, what would you say about that one?
Well, one of the reasons why I am a huge fan of that one is because it takes every single negative point that people try to make of Superman. He's boring. He's you can't tell interesting stories in a modern time. He's too OP. It takes all of those, puts him in a ball, and then just throws him out the window.
We should OP. We should say that it's a term within the comic book fandom, probably all fandoms now. But OP stands for overpowered, meaning like Superman's so overpowered that he can, with one breath, he can blow out an entire red sun. So how can you have him fight a villain if he's that powerful? He's just too overpowered. So people would come up with this term OP.
Right. No, that's it exactly. And Superman, I mean, he was created with a plethora of powers, and so looking at that story, it takes all of those and just completely just proves that those are wrong, because it actually tackles the relevancy of Superman in the comic book itself. and makes a point about in a modern era with more or less in a modern era with more or less these postmodern, superheroes, right? Superheroes that are more vicious, more violent, more edgier, more broken characters, right? And, people who tend to clamor for that, I want my heroes edgy, I want my heroes to dole out the right kind of justice and kill the bastards and all these types of things. It shows the point to have a character who has always been morally focused on, what is right. Especially a character like Superman, who is so overpowered that he could disintegrate anyone he deemed, wrong or, evil or anything, right? To have a character like that to not do that and prove why not doing that is the best way to go. It just sums up everything about why the character is such a great character, and why you can tell a good story with him when you have the right people in the place to do the right things with the character.
Yeah, exactly. And that's it's something that we've talked about for years, like with Batman. There's especially in recent years, it's become a big thing to say, well, if Superman or Batman, if they just start killing, then they're the Punisher. And those are they're different stories for very specific reasons, and that's one of them that really, what's so funny about Truth, Justice, the American Way, Superman versus the Elite, same story. It touches on a lot of those elements, and that really, I think the animation, like it really, they're I think both of them, I'd highly recommend getting your hands on both of them if you can. I think they really, really knock it out of the park.
I mean, I like the animation. I definitely I love the animation because you get to I'm not going to spoil anything, but towards the end you get to see you get to see Superman in one of the purest forms really kind of flex everything that makes Superman. And if you come out of that and you don't think to yourself, man, Superman is badass, then you're just simply lying to yourself.
Exactly. Yeah. No, I couldn't. I feel like Lex Luthor in Superman the movie. Right? Couldn't have said it better myself. And I think what I like about, again, this is something like with Superman, he's got everything. Yeah, Superman has so much. Like, he's one character. One of the closest things in Marvel would be the entire X-Men universe. Could come close to the things that encompass everything that makes up Superman's little, corner of the world. That goes to something that people have sort of kind of lost with the character.
No, I definitely get what you're saying. I mean, he did carry the saying for all those years, truth, justice, and the American way. And it seems like recently more and more that has slowly started to fall out of his, his persona.
Yeah, and and it's not, the American way is not as connected to Superman as, say, the S, the emblem. Because I think even in those original Fleischer cartoons, I believe they're the first ones that started that in their opening. Superman, a never-ending battle for truth, justice, and the American way. There's a few of them after that where they just talk about he's a never-ending proponent of truth and justice. So it's not like it's been completely ripped away because there's some agenda or something. And this is not to attack the guys that did Superman Returns, because I know I've mentioned in other recordings that it didn't do what it could have done as a film. But I do remember watching an interview and they said something like, the American way, what does that even mean anymore? Do we know what that means? Do we even stand for that anymore? And as a culture, I think we've sort of lost the meaning of it. Or at least sort of in a braggadocious way, we've lost the meaning behind it. So Superman has kind of followed that trajectory. That was the thing with the Donner films. It was sort of like, it was meant to look like Norman Rockwell America, right out of a painting, in Smallville, where Superman grows up. But it was this idea of that, Richard Donner talked about that. There's sort of this old there's an old way we used to be, and the way we used to treat each other, and the way we used to kind of be there for this old Americana, the American graffiti generation, right? Like Richard Donner talked about that in interviews before the 78 Superman film came out, right? So that all that kind of element is there. And it's, again, because he lands here and he has all these powers and all these from the time that he is a child, an infant baby, he could take over the world. He's got powers and abilities far beyond, those of mortal men, as they say, right? But I mean, it's seriously, like, he could literally be one of those child emperors from history. At any point, at any time, he could have just went off the rails and just destroyed everything and took over everything. Or whatever he wanted to do, he could have done it. Not only does he, he's a more, he comes from a greater race of people in a point in their history than where we are, but it's like the kind of values of the being neighborly on the farm and stuff. And that's something that Christopher Reeve talked about. And there's this great interview that I was so pleased to see this kind of thing go around social media. There's a lot of other stuff that floats around, but this Christopher Reeve interview from, I believe, 1987, right? And that's what he talked about. Yeah, America was founded on those kind of principles of, you would get on your horse and buggy and you would ride uncomfortably 30 miles to give your neighbor, that was your neighbor 30 miles away by horse and buggy. And you'd go to help them out on the farm or give them, a spoonful of sugar type of thing. He embodies that Americana that goes back to the spirit, no pun intended, but the spirit of America, the spirit of the founding. That's what the American way is. You will try to look out for your neighbor. You'll try to intervene. If there's and he gets made, again, the culture has shifted a lot, so he gets made fun of for the, he's a Boy Scout. He pulls the cat out of a tree. Well, that's the point. Wouldn't you want to be neighborly? Does that make you, what, does it make you hardcore? Are you edgy? Because, I drove by and the little girl, the little girl lives next door. Her cat was in a tree. I didn't even blink, didn't even bother me. What would you do, right? Shouldn't you want to help? Shouldn't you want to help this little girl whose cat is stuck in a tree? And so Superman's here's the thing. He's literally above that because he's flying up in the sky, but he's not above that. That's the point. That's the American way, the American spirit. I mean, there's all this talk in the media, obviously for very valid reasons, as of the time of this recording. There's a lot of talk about what's going on in the Koreas, and particularly North Korea. And I believe, it's probably a lot before, I think 80s or in the 90s, we started sending like food and aid. I mean, they're quote unquote a bitter enemy who's sworn to destroy us, and all this rhetoric over all these years. I believe we drop in grain, and America can do those type of things. And again, despite the fact that literally with the push of a button, anybody running this government every 4 to 8 years could literally destroy all life on Earth, but we haven't done it to this point, right? That's the thing with Superman. He could literally just get up one day and decide, you know what, I want to zap Uzbekistan, or you know what, I'm sick of Australia. He could just destroy the entire continent, right? He has the power and ability to do that, but being so far above everybody, here's a guy who would literally fly down to help a cat out of a tree for some little girl, and that's the heart of the character and the heart of the American way.
Right. No, I feel like Superman is the epitome of do the right thing even when it's not popular, and that's something that always kind of sits with the character, and really when the character is at his highest point, kind of symbolizes what the character has always stood for.
Right. That's one of the great that's one of the great quotes from the comic books. It's Superman. It's a famous moment when he says there is a right and a wrong, and it's not that hard to distinguish the difference. And that's a brilliant moment. And there's Superman. And again, it goes back to that. Like I said, his goodness, because that's been a big time. It's been a big part of the spirit of what people have tried to fight for, to strive for, with here in America. Again, I know it's such a silly thing, and people will make fun of it probably to the end of time. But the idea of the cat in the tree, I sort of just came up with that on the fly here. But I like the idea that, think about that. Despite the fact that he is literally above it, literally up in the sky, he's not above coming down to help a cat out of a tree for a little girl. And that's what Christopher Reeve was really getting at too. And that, like you said, being neighborly, but it's his actions, who he is acting, putting being neighborly into action, right? And that's what Christopher Reeve was talking about in this interview. He's a friend, right? And it was so crazy. This 87, and he could have been talking about. I guarantee you can open up your smartphone tomorrow, read the news headlines, read what's going on, and it would be like Christopher Reeve was talking about the world that we live in today and what you'll wake up to tomorrow. Because he had mentioned that, in this era where it's like there's all these crazy films out there, there's a lot of violence out there in films, and we still have that, a lot of crazy action films now. He was talking about, so like, if you're just a single mom and you're working hard and you want to take your daughter for a good time at the movies, and how do you know if you're walking into Deadpool, you're like, oh, Deadpool, he's a superhero, right? Like the Marvel, it's be like Captain America, right? And then you walk into Deadpool and it's like, whoa. You have that element that Reeve was talking about, and it's still prescient today, right? That Superman is an outlet for that. But also, what Reeve was talking about, he's like, people, they're sort of afraid to leave their homes. They don't know if they're going to be attacked in the street, or it's like he was talking about like the kind of uncertainty and the upheaval in the country, and people feeling very uncomfortable and not, completely safe in the society, which is what everybody seems to talk about now. So here's 87, and it sounds like the world we live in today. And he was talking about, again, Superman can be an escape from all that. But more importantly is that American way, being neighborly and acting that out, but that he's a friend, right? It's like, well, yeah, that's in the All-Star Superman comic book. Is that, going back to that again, he's literally above it, but not above coming down just to be a friend in that moment for that girl, just to talk to her, just to give her somebody to talk to, and to tell her, to tell her like, hey, you know what? The doctor, I forgot, there was another character she was talking about that ignored her. She's like, no, he really did get held up. Things are not as bad as they seem. Just to talk to her and give her the time of day. Whereas again, he could have gone up there and he could have just snatched her right off that roof and he could have thrown her in the paddy wagon, right? And then they even make a point that I believe it's the SWAT team member that's like, what's he doing? And he stood up there for hours. I think the sun went down because he was talking to her for hours. And then he will do that, to be that friend for her, willing to give everyone a chance, to be his friend. And that personifies the character and the spirit, like I said, the kind of things that were, in America, at least for generations, that was kind of the things that people talked about. And so for Superman, that's why he embodies that. And that's why he's such, like I said, he will always be the most relevant and relatable character, because he's just constructed so well that he can cover all those different topics. And at the end of the day, even down on his most basic level, but again, it's the idea that he would be the friend to go and talk to somebody who is going through something, as traumatic as considering suicide, or as simple as they got their cat stuck in a tree, and he's willing to go that distance and literally go the extra miles around the corners of the world to do that. And that is Superman.
I think you clearly said it all yourself.
But this is not the end for us, though. We want everybody to tune in next time for our next adventure, because we'll be talking about the Cape Crusader himself.
What?
Batman, you say? Coming for you. Yes. For you out there in the audience. Coming for you all. We'll bring that to you in our next episode. We hope that you'll come back and make yourself at home again here in the House of L. Mr. EDL. I'm Spirit, the spirit of film.
And don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button. And even if you didn't like this, do what Superman would do. He would hit that like and subscribe button to support us, because it is the right thing to do. And don't forget to ding that little notification bell for all the new latest updates of our channel.
Yes, there is a right and a wrong in this world, and it's hitting that subscribe and like button on this.
And Spirit, on behalf of everyone, I'd like to thank you for sharing all your knowledge and emotions about Superman on this podcast today.
Don't thank me. We're all part of the same team. Good night.
Okay, do you want me to start over, or do you want me to just lead into it? No, don't start over. Just pick up like you're finishing up putting the cherry on top. Sometimes you set up something that's just, you were speaking so outwardly, I'm like, yeah, it's always amazing when they do these kind of stories. I'm like, yeah, like Quest for Peace or Injustice, shit. or complete betrayals of the character. That's what I'm saying. You don't think about what you say. Or like earlier when you were like, yeah, and like, you know, he doesn't just fight for like truth and like justice. He takes on like crooked politicians and like, you know, real estate swindles. That's truth and justice.
Yeah, I know. That's why I started to die out when I was reading.
I heard you say that, and I was like, what the fuck?
Now I'm gonna volleyball the question back on that. Now I'm gonna volleyball. Shut up.
Blah blah blah. All right, go.